We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Jonathan Evans, City Manager for the City of Riviera Beach. Also, I have the opportunity to serve as the Executive Director for the Community Redevelopment District. Thank you all for being here tonight to talk about a very important topic, and actually a topic that's provided for both in our charter and also spoken to in state statutes as it relates to making sure there's fair and equitable representation in our community and communities across the state of Florida and across the nation for that matter. So we're excited about this particular presentation. You will hear from subject matter experts that will talk about the analysis that was done here in the city of Riviera Beach, and then ultimately what some of the next steps are provided. For those of you that may be the first time in this building, the restrooms are directly outside of the doors. If you make a quick left and go down the hall, they'll be on your right-hand side, both the ladies' and males' restrooms. We have some light refreshments. If you would like a copy of this presentation, if you have a smart device, you can scan the QR code and you can be able to download that, and then we do have some copies back in the back of the room. Additionally, we have provided for a sign-in sheet. If you do provide us with your contact information when we do have subsequent conversations and discussions related to this topic, we'll certainly make sure that you're informed accordingly. At this time, I do want to recognize some of our sitting elected officials or their representatives that are in the room and certain staff. We have Councilperson Miller Anderson that's here with us this evening. And then we also have Dr. Glenn Spiritus' legislative aide, Mr. Horace Towns here, also a member of our Riviera Beach Housing Authority. And from a staff standpoint, I do have the City Attorney, Ms. Dawn Wynn, in the back of the room, and then Assistant City Manager, Ms. Deirdre Jacobs. So again, thank you everyone for being here this evening. And at this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Schultz to introduce his team and to kick off the discussion concerning redistricting.
Thank you, Mr. Evans, for organizing this forum, regarding redistricting for the residents and council members of Riviera Beach. We are looking forward to an informative, meeting, not only for our audience, but also for us. As Mr. Evans has indicated on the wonderful flyer announcing this meeting, and his insightful introductory comments, the goal of redistricting is to have a more equal population distribution across the city's 4 sub-city districts. Thus, districts' residents would have an equal opportunity to seek election to a council seat, and each district's resident would have equal access to their district's council member. Also, the City of Riviera Beach Charter states that there should be no more than a 8% population, variation or deviation, if you will, across the districts. In a moment, we will begin a slideshow presenting, highlighting our first, report to the city. This report examines the current population distribution across the 4 sub-city council districts. It also discusses the rules, laws, and guidelines that form the framework of our analysis. However, before we get to the slideshow presentation, I would like to spend a minute, or two, introducing the team that is assisting Riviera Beach in reviewing our current districts. Who are we? I am Dr. Ronald Schultz, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Geosciences at FAU. I spent 35 years as a regular faculty member, of the department, rising through the ranks, doing, quote, good works, unquote, in teaching, research, and service. The traditional standards for faculty across the nation and the world. A great deal of my work was for Florida communities and agencies, especially in South Florida. Much of my work is referred to as applied geographic analysis, especially demographic and population studies of locational issues and the drawing of boundaries for various purposes, including city council and commission districts that we are discussing tonight. I am a product of FAU. I was an undergraduate student in the first class of 800 or so that attended FAU in 1964. I graduated, went out to the Pacific Northwest for graduate school in geography, and returned 5 years later as an assistant professor. I became involved with drawing and redrawing city and other district boundaries in the early and mid-1980s, when I was asked by several South Florida cities to assist them in creating election and representation districts for their councils or commissions. I was asked, I believe, because I had become quite visible in Broward and Palm Beach County School Board attendance boundary issues. For several decades, I worked independently, doing local government districting studies. More recently, James Gammett Clark and Michael Stamm, have joined me, in undertaking these studies. All told, we have completed over 70 formal districting and redistricting studies and recommendations. Mr. Gammett Clark, who will be leading us through our graphical presentation in a moment, is university instructor in geographical information systems at FAU. He is especially interested in the application of unmanned aerial systems, we think of those as drones, in geographic research, and in geovisualization applications, the art of seeing what's really around us. James earned his bachelor's and his master's degrees in geography at FAU in the early 2000s. Prior to returning to the department in 2006 as an instructor, James worked as a senior planner at Palm Beach County's Planning Division in its GIS section. Mr. Michael Stamm is Assistant City Manager and Director of Planning and Economic Development for the City of Pembroke Pines in South Broward. He has been with Pembroke Pines since 2004. Mr. Stamm is also an adjunct professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at FAU. His teaching focuses on GIS applications in planning, especially in the area of visualization technology. Michael earned his bachelor's and master's degrees at FAU. In the weeks following this presentation, we will be developing several adjustments for Riviera Beach's council districts. Your comments and concerns will be considered as we create several options for City Council consideration. As Mr. Evans has indicated, we anticipate presenting our recommendations at the May 15th City Council meeting. Thank you for your participation in tonight's forum. Now, excuse me a moment. Now, Mr. James Gammett Clark will come to the podium.
Good evening, everybody. Very good. So as Dr. Schultz was mentioning, my name is James Gammett Clark, and I am an instructor at the Florida Atlantic University's Geosciences Department. And again, we're here this evening to present our analysis of your current election districts. So this is the outline that we'll be going through. Dr. Schultz has already mentioned the redistricting team. I'll review our names in print, just so you can get the spelling. Then we'll go over the pertinent parts of the city charter as it pertains to redistricting. Then we'll talk about the process that have been going through and will be going through for the remainder of this particular project. We'll then talk about the data that's formed the basis of our analysis. And then we'll actually get into the population analysis, looking at the 2020 census data, the enumeration of the city of Riviera Beach, plus the population projection that we've created for this particular project. And then we'll talk about the next steps that will be undertaken as part of the project. So there you see the spelling of all our names. I'm James Gammett Clark. Again, we have Dr. Schultz and Michael Stamm, all with Florida Atlantic University. Dr. Schultz and I with the Department of Geosciences, and Mrs. Stamm is with the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. Here we see the part of your city charter that deals with redistricting. And of course, it talks about how 4 of your districts will be split amongst the city's boundaries, and specifically that the deviation must not exceed 8%. This is actually more stringent than is the typical 10%, and so that's a laudable accomplishment on the part of the city to strive for that stricter standard. Here we see your existing city boundaries as they stand right now. And as Dr. Schultz stated, as part of this process, we'll be trying to create new alternatives, but it's important to note that we have not started that process yet. That process will not start until after we've heard the feedback from the public and from the council, which is why we're gathered here this evening. So, part one, what we're here to discuss this evening, is the current district analysis. We'll, as part of that, we had to engage in a population estimate, as I mentioned, and we're here this evening to present the results of that analysis. Part two won't commence until after this evening's meeting, and that's the part where we'll actually create map alternatives using your feedback from the public and the council, as I mentioned. And then once we've created those alternatives, we'll bring them back to you at another public forum where we'll gain the feedback of both the council and the public. Hopefully, at that point, the council will be able to select one of the alternatives that we've created, and it'll move on for ordinance, adoption by ordinance. But of course, that's not always the case. Sometimes we have to go back and tweak things. So we'll see how that goes. Good. Okay, so the data that we use in this study, the primary data, is the same data that's used by governmental agencies all across the country, whether you're talking at the city level, or the county level, or the state level, or the federal level. It's all the same data. And specifically, we're talking about the 2020 Census Redistricting Summary File. Now, specifically, when you're engaging in redistricting at the city level, you have to use the smallest enumeration unit that the census makes available, and that is the city block, the block level. And that's because when you're creating districts at the city level, you need the smallest geographic unit together as your jigsaw pieces to fit together to make boundaries that give you equal population. So each of those blocks will ultimately be aggregated together to form each of the 4 voting districts. And the second set of data we used was housing data provided to us by city staff from the city of Riviera Beach. Okay? And the reason for that we use this data is very important and very simple. The census is already 4 years old. Census Day was April 1st of 2020. That's more than 4 years ago, right? So it's starting to get a little bit longer in the tooth. It's starting to get dated. And the city would certainly not want to go through all the effort and the expense of going through the redistricting process only using outdated data, not recognizing the reality on the ground that construction has occurred in the city since April 1st of 2020. So they provided us that housing data, and from that housing data, we've created a population estimate that takes us through March of this year. So let's look at the 2020 data, right? Not accounting for the housing that's occurred, but just going back to Census Day of 2020. According to that data, the population of the city of Riviera Beach was 37,604. If we divide that by 4, that gives us an average population for each of the 4 districts that are subject to redistricting of 9,401. Okay, so if we were only using that data, that would be the magic number that we'd be working towards as we try to achieve population equality. If we dig into this data a little bit more, we see a couple of interesting things. One, your largest district is District 1 at 15,793 people. That's 6,392 people more than the supposed ideal average of 9,401, right? So it's way above average. Similarly, the smallest district is District 4 at 4,291 people. Again, that's 5,110 people fewer than the ideal average. So it's way below average, right? This is a problem. So, as I was kind of alluding to, the current commission districts are heavily imbalanced. We have a total deviation of 160.5%. If we divide that by the 4 districts in question, this gives us a mean deviation of 40.1%. Remember, your charter says that it should not be more than 8%. So here we are at 40%. This is a problem. Another way to measure the imbalance in the districts is to look at the spread number. That is, look at the deviation associated with the largest district and add that to the deviation associated with the smallest district. And we see yet another very large number, which is 122.4%. Again, way above the 8% threshold that's called for in the city charter. Okay? So that's just the 2020 data. Now let's talk about how we came up with the population estimates. Here we see a table that summarizes the data that was provided to us by the city staff, and it shows all the construction that's taken place in the city since Census Day of 2020 through to March of this year. And we see that by this construction, we can estimate that about 2,261 people will have been added to the city since April 1st of 2020. And the majority of those people have been located in District 1. 1,465 of those people are in District 1. So District 1, which is already the largest district by population in the city, has gotten even larger. So here we see that counting for that estimate, we believe that your current population is approximately 39,865 people. And if we divide that by 4, that gives us an average of 9,966, so just under 10,000. So as we move forward, as we create the 4 districts, ideally, as called for by your charter, each district should be just under 10,000 people each. That's the ideal, that's the goal. Okay. Again, we see that under this scenario, the largest district is still District 1. It's at 17,261 people now. That's 7,295 more than the theoretical average, while the smallest district is still District 4 at 4,579 people, or 5,387 more than the theoretical average. So what we're seeing is that once we account for this population estimate, once we account for the growth that we know has taken place in Riviera Beach since April 1st of 2020, your population imbalance has become even worse, right? The total deviation has grown to 163%, and the mean deviation has grown slightly to 40.8%. And then the spread has gotten even worse again. It's now at 127.3%. All of these numbers far exceeding that 8% threshold number we spoke about. So, what are the next steps? The next steps are we need to proceed to redistricting. Your districts are severely out of balance. And of course, this is a product of the fact that the city of Riviera Beach has not been through the redistricting process in over 40 years. And so when you go for over 40 years, it's not surprising that this situation of imbalance comes to pass. Okay? So what we're going to have to do moving forward, collectively, is go towards an overall pattern of district boundary changes where the populations of Districts 2 and 4 need to increase, while that of District 1 needs to significantly decrease. And this, in turn, is going to require large aerial changes, right? And I mentioned this now before we start this process because, of course, when people hear the word change, it makes them uneasy, it makes them nervous, and understandably so. Okay, so I'm just trying to prepare you now that the districts are out of balance, and so you should expect not small tweaks to the district boundaries, but significant tweaks to the district boundaries as we move forward. So, after we get your input, we'll take that input back and we'll start creating some different alternatives for the council and for the public to consider, and then we'll bring them back for you and we'll see what you think of them. That's the next step. How we do that, okay, so we have some very important rules that define how we go about that redistricting process. The first one is, per your city charter, achieving reasonable population equality across the districts, right? Again, the charter calls for no more than 8% overall deviation, but it also states that To as great an extent as possible, they should be as close to exactly equal as we can make them. Okay, so that's our first goal. And as we do this, we will also make sure that we adhere, as we always do, to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which states that arbitrary dilution of minority population clusters and other discriminatory practices are strictly prohibited. Our second criteria that guides us is geographic contiguity and appropriate compactness. So we don't want districts that are stretching out like a spider web all across the city. We want to make them nice and compact if we can. And we'll try to make sure that those follow major natural and man-made boundaries where possible. We will also seek to respect the integrity of communities of interest, and to as much a degree as possible, we'll seek to minimize the degree of change in the pre-existing patterns of the existing districts. That said, per the City Charter, per the Voting Rights Act, population equity is of primary importance. The others are significant in guiding our decisions towards reaching reasonable population balance, but population balance is the ultimate goal. It's the only way that the election process is fair for the residents of the city. Very good. So with that, I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you may have. Or we will be happy to answer your questions. Yes?
There's a lot of construction going on right now on Broadway. I think there's at least 150 units, as well as a proposal for what's going on in Lake Park, the Nautilus 2000 or whatever, to be proposed to go where the old Winn-Dixie supermarket was, and that has 399 units. So that all, aside from the Lake Park, that takes place in Section 2, which you're saying is smaller than it should be, District 2. And this population will increase a lot in like 3 years. So if you then already make it larger, what is going to happen when more people come there?
Right. Excellent question. Thank you very much. Right. So we can expect that the city is constantly going to be changing, right? And it's impossible to create districts that will be perfect from now until the end of time. And that's why the Charter calls for us to engage in this redistricting process every 10 years, right? This shouldn't be the end of the discussion. We should be coming back after the next census. Not necessarily we. Somebody should be coming back after the next census and engaging this process again. And then 10 years after that, engaging it again and again and again. And so you have to draw the line somewhere as to your planning horizon. And the city identified March as a reasonable cutoff for population. What we try not to do is, speculate as to a development that may or may not actually come to pass. If we planned for a development that a developer was working on and then, they went bankrupt or something and that project never came to pass, that would mess up the numbers, right? So that's why March was set as a hard, firm deadline that we know the construction on the ground. As for future projects, we'll have to come back and discuss that in the next effort, I would suggest. Yes?
I have a question. I know at the state level, when we went through the redistricting process, there were either additional districts added, and Congress, we saw that. But is there any consideration as part of this process for the city where there could be essentially maybe a fifth district that's not citywide, but does this process potentially allow for an increase in the number of districts?
Let's point out, that when it comes to redistricting has a bad name, has a bad reputation, right? And part of that is because you often see with redistricting, political machinations, people playing games, okay? It tends to be far less the case at the municipal level, which is where we are now, rather than at, the federal or the state level. And of course, that's why the city is not doing this themselves. They've hired the consultants to come in a transparent process and provide a layer of insulation between the elected officials and the people that are drawing the maps, right? So we're supposed to be independent. The Charter, to answer your question specifically, calls for 5 districts, one of which is at large, the whole city, and the other 4 splitting up the city. So that's the rule. So unless the Charter is changed to call for a different number of districts, then no, the number we have is the number we have. Yeah,
that was my first question about the charter. Two questions. So we're already going into another cycle where districts 1, 3, and 5 will be suiting up to run for election. So these proposed changes will come after the next election. And will you guys be making these changes off data, or will there be some input from the community, the city manager, who will really influence the new districts?
So obviously you've just had your election cycle, so your next election isn't for 2 years, correct? Next year, okay. So, of course, the state charter says that, or I think it was House Bill 411, that's what I thought. 411 states that you can't change the boundaries 270 days before an election, right? There's no reason to think that we can't get this done well before that deadline. So we're moving on the city's timeline, right? We can get these elections decided upon and voted upon well before that 270-day threshold. What was the other question? I'm sorry. Oh, the feedback. Yeah, we're here back now for your feedback. We're here now for feedback from the community and from the council districts. No boundaries have been drawn yet, so that's why we're here this evening. Yes.
One second. I got it.
I want your expert opinion on this. Since we have 4 districts already, and I know you're just the redistrict person, but why do we need District 5 when we can make a mayor a strong mayor? Since we're redistricting the whole city, why do we need a 5th seat? And should we, on a logical scale, make the mayor a strong mayor and delete the 5th seat?
Let Mr. Stam address this question. Okay?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Stam. Like Mr. Evans, I work for city government as well as my day job. Your question's a very good one, but it's really governed by the charter. So cities have charter review boards where they make recommendations to the city council, and then those items before the charter typically get reviewed in an election cycle or on a ballot. The charter is your governing documents on how your city is to run, and that's really a document of the people. So it usually takes a referendum to make changes to the charter to make a change that you're suggesting. So in the absence of that change, we're working with the charter as it's drafted. The city has to take these steps now to make these corrections to the map so that you can move forward.
We have, and I have the microphone here, and I'm going to take it to a person, so I've got a couple here in the back. But I do want to acknowledge Councilperson Spiritus has joined us, as well as Councilperson Lanier, and then legislative aide for Councilperson McCoy is also present.
Hi. If the 2 criteria, one being the reasonable population across the districts and then the geographic continuity, if those are the 2 criteria, what exactly are you looking for from us? I mean, what type of feedback if this is what you have to do?
So when we do redistricting, residents know your community better than we can ever know our community. You're in the community, you're out in the streets, you know how certain neighborhoods work together, certain things work together. I'll give you an example. Was it 2 years ago now, we worked on the city of Fort Lauderdale. City of Fort Lauderdale has a whole bunch of homeowners associations, and some of those associations seem to complement each other or work well together. Some of those had different representation, or maybe they had similar development patterns. So if there's feedback that you know about your community, that's what we're here to listen to and to gather. But when you look at the map, we're still bound by the construct and the shape of the city, right? So we try to use things like, if you look at the map today, you can see how Blue Heron Boulevard is a major divider between some of the districts. It's a very identifiable boundary. So when we look at some of these things, we look for very similar identifiable boundaries that makes it easy for people to describe the districts, to understand the districts. Right now, District 4, it's on the other side of the intercoastal. It's very easy to describe, but the problem is that population is now falling behind. So it's going to have to come across in some way, shape, or form, and how we do that is hopefully going to come from feedback from the residents, and as we make our proposals, we want to be able to gather that input from you. So I hope that answers your question. It's, you know your community, and there's some things that maybe it's like communities, maybe it's maybe where you're going to see future growth, and you know how this community has grown over time, and maybe they're very similar in terms of housing styles. In my city where I work, in Pembroke Pines, we've grown from east to west. Communities in the east are very similar, communities in the west are very similar, so that's often dictated in how our map is shaped. We expect to hear some of those similar items from the public so that we can give you our best effort in creating the maps.
Also, I do want to recognize School Board Member Edward Ferguson's here with us as well.
If I can just add to that answer. Another part of your feedback is definitely going to come when we come back with the alternatives. You know, it's usually at that point where residents will have sometimes strong opinions about, oh, I like alternative 1, or I like alternative 2, or I like alternative 3. And that feedback's not only going to go to us, but obviously your council people too, when they're considering which district to vote for, which alternative to vote for.
I'm curious because I'm looking at these numbers a little bit in disbelief about Singer Island, particularly because of the pandemic. And these numbers are from 2020, which was maybe right before it or during it, but we've had this huge surge, which has been in every headline in the country, about Southeast Florida exploding from people declaring residency from up north. How are you going to accommodate that massive sea change that's never happened in history before until now?
So that is a very, very good question. So we went to city staff and said, hey, what has been built since Census Day 2020? Now, we all know during the census, this was the most accessible census ever. Cities everywhere went out there. We were handing out flyers, fill out your forms. City Manager Evans knows every one of those people that gets counted means dollars back to the communities, and we did our best as cities across the country to try to get people to fill out their forms. Obviously, nobody could have predicted the pandemic doing what it did in terms of relocating people to Florida, but that's why we went to your staff. We went to city staff and said, okay, hey, what has gotten their certificate of occupancy between Census Day and March 2024? Those are new developments that are being occupied. Again, we have to use the best data sets that are available. And census data, Public Law Data Set 94171, is the most effective and accurate data set that's available. And when you use that in conjunction with certificate of occupancy data to show the new growth, those numbers are probably the most accurate that we will be able to get at any moment at the scale that we need it at in order to conduct redistricting.
And then I think you were talking about the idea that some people are changing their primary residence, indicating what they would be counted by in the census. If a bunch of people have changed their primary residence since Census Day 2020, that's not going to be reflected until 2030. And
Homesteading would, where the certificate of occupancy isn't going to show anybody that homesteaded in an existing.
well, we're going. Okay, yeah.
Well, keep in mind, a homestead doesn't count people. Well, a homestead only counts that's what they're calling as their residence. It doesn't count the people in that residence. And that's really where we require the census data, which brings it down to that census block level, that smallest unit of measure, in order to get that information there.
For the point, or for clarity, am I understanding correctly that I was under the impression that by adding the population or more people, it would potentially add more seats. But effectively what's happening is you're just redrawing the boundaries, not necessarily adding seats, but adding more people to the district so that they're equally proportioned?
Correct. So one of the things that gets really confusing with redistricting at the local municipal level, as opposed to redistricting at the state or the federal level, is after Census Day at the federal level, they use Public Law 94171, the same data set that we're using, but that moves the seats for Congress. That's why Florida added seats, because we added population, and other states lost seats. Municipal redistricting is not like that. Municipal redistricting is governed by what's in your charter. How many districts are assigned to the city via the charter? And the construct is very well laid out in terms of your charter on how that works. And it's often a confusing step when you're looking at state, federal, and then bringing it down to the local level. And it's sometimes, at least that's why we have to have meetings like this, so that we can educate the public on how this process works. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I'm excited about the turnout. we've been to some meetings where we've had one person show up. So the fact that you're here as part of this process is really important.
I have a question. Does consideration of homeowners, the Neighborhood Homeowners Association, which effectively follows some of the geographic lines of the districts? That's my first question. And my second question is, will this trigger re-elections for when districts are redistricted? Will this trigger re-elections for the existing districts?
So the majority of time when we do redistricting, it's in effect for the next election. The state passed a bill that outlined when cities could redistrict. They did this to avoid some of the politics that often comes along with this. So in House Bill 411, they clarified that redistricting cannot happen prior to 270 days prior to the next election. So you just had an election. If we would have, again, I'm using a theoretical here, if we would have been doing redistricting in February, right before that election, we would have been in violation of the state statute. So here we are today. We're going to be looking at the map, and we'll be able to provide information well in advance of the next election cycle so that the next districts, people will know where they're running from, as it's outlined in your charter. The second part of that is homeowners associations. This is the kind of feedback that we would get from you as a resident, from your elected body, that'll help us shape some of these districts. If homeowners associations are really, really strong, so everybody's heard of Century Village maybe. Century Village in my community is a super strong area, and they don't want to be subdivided. That's feedback that we would take into account as we're considering your map options. 270, yes.
270. After that is completed, will that trigger a re-election for the existing district?
Normally, I say normally, again, I can go and I'll go dig back through your charter. Normally what happens, it's in effect for the next election. So the people will continue to serve in their districts. It goes into effect for the next election. So I think you guys are looking at March 2026 is your next election, City Manager? 2025, okay. So we're right at that threshold right now. Oh, you're offset by a year, that's right.
I have a couple questions. One, I missed it because I stepped outside, but in regards to the charter and adding seats, what does that take to add? And I'm asking this question because I come from a town in New York that has 30,000 people. They have 6 council seats and 3 at large. So we're a city of 40,000 and we only have 4 with 1 at large. So is there a process that has to be done, or is that something I need to probably talk to the city manager about?
So again, I would defer to the city manager on this,
Okay.
but you have a charter review board that typically looks at issues within the charter.
Okay.
And normally the way charter review boards work is they make a recommendation to the council passes an ordinance, then that item gets placed on a ballot, then the ballot goes to the electorate.
Okay.
The electorate decides if that's a good idea, they pass it, or they don't pass it. I will tell you this, 4 districts for a city this size is pretty common from what we've seen. I'll use Pembroke Pines where I'm from. We've got a city of 170,000 people. We have 4 district commissioners and a mayor who runs at large. City of Fort Lauderdale has 6. They're about 180,000. So for the size, I know what you're saying because every place is slightly different, but this is actually pretty common from what we've worked with.
Okay. My second question is, and I don't know if you're taking this now, but can we make suggestions to you as to how to redistrict? Because I'm looking at this map, and I live way over on the west side. I'm off a Military Trail between Military and Haverhill. And I'm looking at it, and I always thought that our district was the Military Trail thing where it went from top to bottom. Can it be done where, so west of 95, that could be one district, and then you come over and you do another slice there for another district? If you're trying to build up the District 4, maybe they go to Broadway down, and then the other two districts would split that in between. Is that something that can be done, or do you have to stay within?
So
Yeah.
if you looked at some of the criteria, do we try to minimize too much change? Sure, if it's possible. But what you're doing in your mind, just what you described, that's the puzzle we start to work on. We start to look at whether it's a natural boundary like I-95, or whether it's how we work with the intercoastal. The goal at the end of this, when we start to look at redistricting, is that you really want there to be clear, identifiable boundaries, and we want those districts to kind of be a common area. As Dr. Schultz says, we've worked on over 70 projects collectively between ourselves, and each city, each town, they've got their own little nuance. They've got little things about them that are similar and different, and those things come out in public meetings like this, and we get feedback, which help guides how we draw these maps.
Can I also add, I think you're suggesting a series of north-south running districts going from east to west or west to east. I mean, you could look at something like that, but to your imagination, your perfectly right imagination of saying, oh, can we carve down a boundary down 95? Yes, we would love to carve a boundary down 95, but once we start looking at the data, it's very possible that won't come up to that approximately 10,000 population number that we're looking at. Especially when you look at this map and you keep in mind that, in a perfect world, all the city blocks would all be the same size and there'd be an equal number of people in every city block. But of course, you have large swaths of land in Riviera District that aren't residential. So that's going to make the process of coming up with districts where each district has about 10,000 people all the more challenging when you have to go over large swaths of land with no people in it.
Now, so my question is, I understand based on the charter we have 5 districts that are established, including a mayor. So because of our charter, it precludes us as of right now from actually adding an additional district, and you guys are doing it based off what we currently have. And throughout the state of Florida, most municipalities range between 5 and 6 elected officials, depending on if there's a strong mayor form of government or a council manager, weak mayor council form of government. But I guess my question is, if you're doing this strictly, majority based off the data from the census and whatever else data that you collect in regards to figuring out the population within these different districts and drawing those boundaries, the public involvement portion of this, what's the purpose outside of which I'm fine with, but what's the purpose outside of informing us on what your process is and the methodology that you're using to draw these districts?
So, generally speaking, it's just good public policy to get public feedback early on in the process and then after we present options. It's good public policy. The fact that public meetings occur on a regular basis, it's the way the public gets to interact with their government. So from that perspective, it's really just good public policy that the elected officials get to hear from the residents as they see these maps. As we were working on our contract with the city, public outreach and public process is important. Having these types of forums, making sure that we can get people out here to participate in the process. As we've stated before, we've had meetings where one resident shows up and they're not part of the process. So then when they see the map on the books, they're like, the commission's sitting there like, we held multiple public forums, we advertised, we did this, we did that, we did it during a commission meeting. Nobody showed up. The fact that we're here today and that there will be a public process, most redistricting occurs by ordinance that's adopted before the city commission, again, another public meeting. Those elements allow you as a resident to provide feedback to your elected body and also to us as consultants as we start to formulate this puzzle.
Well, there's multiple ways to carve up the pie, right? And that's effectively what we're doing, right? There's not one solution to this problem. There are multiple solutions to this problem. And I can attest, we can all attest to the many projects that we've done where the feedback that we've gotten from the public and from the council has been, very important to the end result. So you tell us, hey, we really need to protect this neighborhood as part of District A or B or C. That's something we take into account. And then, as I mentioned before, when we actually get to the alternatives, you betcha that the feedback from the public has a very serious impact upon what the council will ultimately decide upon.
And I'm going to add one other item. When James was presenting, he talked to you, because this hasn't been done in such a long period of time, the change is going to feel much more dramatic than had this been happening every 10 years in line with the census. So this is a long time coming, and getting this change done, it's important. Right now, if you look at the numbers that we showed you, one district represents about 4,500 people, plus or minus. Another district represents almost 17,000. So the goal of redistricting is equal representation and making sure that each of these districts have approximately the same amount of population. And if you can put that goal in the back of your mind as we work through this process, I think it'll be easier for people to try to understand and grasp, because this map is going to look different with our proposals. And the first time you look at it, there's going to be a little shock and awe. You'll be, oh my goodness, that's crazy, right? But because we've gotten this far, it's going to feel that way. I think that's the easiest way to say it. And I see some doubting faces out there, but that's why we're having this process. That's why you're getting a chance to get answers to your questions. Sir.
Okay, when you looked at this, you looked at it from 2020. If you go back maybe 5 years earlier, some of those houses and that population wasn't there. So when they started adding these houses, wherein if it was in place there's houses, there could have been a restaurant. Would that change the dynamics of it?
So this is where I get to come in, and I'm a city guy, right? So my day job is I'm a city guy.
Okay.
Early on in the census, so we did the census in 2020, so about 2013, 2014, the census comes knocking on cities' doors. And they say, hey, you got to tell us where your new housing is. You got to tell us where this new development is. And they keep doing that up until a point so that they can create their database of addresses so that when that census form comes to your house, it's there. Now remember, it's important. Census Day is a line in the sand. Every agency utilizes census data as the kickstart to this process. Now, some cities have it in their charter, they have to do it every 4 years. So then they're relying on census data as the baseline and then various projections. We've worked in a variety of capacities that the data might be a projection of a projection of a projection. But what we do know is that the 2020 census data is the best available data to start from. So that house that was a restaurant, the hope is that that address got put into the database by staff when we started this process back in 2013, 2014. Okay. I know my team at City Hall, they send you this packet, and you have to sign on the dotted line that you're not going to share this information with anybody, that all this information is protected. You fill out this stuff and you bring out this information, and then the census comes, they come knocking. And then they use other data sets to start to maximize that information. Then they come to you and they say, hey, city, did you do any annexations? Have you changed your boundary? And you provide that information to them so that they can try to put together the most accurate data set ever. Now, there's another thing in our report that, as you read it, the census, because they were really trying to be protective of people, there's differential privacy. They kind of did some things with the census blocks to make sure that people's information was very much protected, that you couldn't figure out who lived in a house, especially in a situation where there was maybe 1 or 2 blocks that didn't have a lot of population. So this census was the most complex, but also the largest census that we've ever encountered, and there was more ways for people to fill out their forms this time than there have been in our history.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
If you can get any information that might date back to the reason why this looked like that, because at some point in areas that District 1, the reason it's so large is because in those areas, there was no communities. And so as things started going, there was no place to put other places like in the west side. And so only place that had available area was District 1.
So what we've seen, again, I can't go back in time when this first district was drawn, you know, but let me add this. So as the city is annexed or taken on new property, more than likely they placed some of those things in some of these districts. As it grew west, they looked at the natural boundary of Blue Heron. Like you suggested, James even mentioned that there's these big areas where we don't have population, and they just found ways to connect them. I am sure if you did a full analysis and looked at every single annexation over time, there was a reason why they placed those in theirs, and it was more than likely a geographic reason.
Just when you get ready to make your whatever, just make sure you include all of the information if you can get it, and you'll find out the reason it's like that. Riviera Beach is a whole different type of place.
Sure.
When you see things, you never, like you say, you know, you in, what, Pembroke Pines?
Yep.
You will never see this in Pembroke Pines.
You'd be surprised what we did out there. Yeah, we almost had the Louisiana Purchase out in Pembroke Pines. You know, we doubled our population in about 5 years back after Andrew.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions. One question is, I thought I read that part of the analysis is to look at what's equitable, and so I'm very curious if you can unpack what that means for your analysis. The second question / comment that I have is that split on the water has always seemed very bizarre to me because water is water. And so if you have a strong advocate on one side but not as strong of an advocate on the other side, well, that might have some implications. So I just want to throw that out there. And then the last question I have is just, it's always been peculiar to me, what are those cutouts in District 1 and District 3?
So those cutouts are areas that aren't within the city municipal boundary. So those either unincorporated or they fall within another municipality. Okay. Unincorporated in this situation. One of the things I want you to notice is that we're using your municipal boundary when we're looking at this, so the water is part of your municipal boundary. So we can logically connect from one side of the intercoastal to the other side of the intercoastal as we move through this.
No, I understand, but it's like if you put chemicals on one side, it's the same body of water. That's what I want to say.
That said, just keep in mind that very soon these boundaries aren't going to matter anymore, right? And District 4 is not going to look like that anymore. The water is not going to be an issue. It's a moot point after we're done with this process. As for the equity issue, right? So when the whole point of redistricting is population equity. And usually that's for, well, one, making sure that you have equal access to your representative, right? So a smaller district will typically have an advantage. Its residents would have an advantage in terms of access to its elected representative. Now, in the city of Riviera Beach, that's not so as much of an issue because every district is voted at large. So that lessens the issue of equity in that regard. However, it is certainly an issue, as Dr. Schultz suggested, in terms of running for office, right? Because if you want to run for office in District 4, you have to live in District 4. On the most extreme example, not that you'd ever see this, but just a hypothetical, imagine a district that consisted of one house. Well, you'd have to live in that house to be elected to the council. That's not fair. That's not equitable. So creating districts that are of equal size or as close to equal size as we can get, that's what we mean when we talk about population equity. It's about access to representation. It's about access to serving on government.
You could also add in the fact, so if an elected official were to have to go knock on doors, think about it. So district, today, 17,000 people live in one district. They're knocking on a lot more doors than somebody's knocking in another district. That representation, it takes a lot more to get out to that voice. And really, that's where that equity comes in. Now, your charter actually makes it more stringent with that 8% number as opposed to what we usually deal with was about 10% deviation between the districts. So if you put that hat on for just a moment, even sometimes the geography changes, you know? It's probably a lot easier to run in District 4, again, not knowing your politics, just from a geography standpoint and a number of houses standpoint, than it would be to run in another district where you're talking to 17,000 people. So that equity issue really comes into play a lot.
My question is, so you guys are trying to get this done before the next election in 2025, is that correct?
Our goal is to give the commission, the council, a map by May 15th, a series of maps that they can choose from to make that decision.
Okay, and specifically, who called for this particular redistricting?
I would.
It's provided for in the charter. This is something that every 10 years the city should have undertaken, but it is, 40 years since the city has done it. So we're moving forward with that particular process as it stands right now.
So just for clarification, you're saying that there will not be any additional seats added to the council? Or
So,
with the,
as I
because
mentioned,
if you split this up into, say, 6, 7 districts, are you saying that, how is that going to be, how are those districts going to be represented?
we will be giving the council a series of maps that split this city into 4 districts. Each map will have 4 districts. The only way you could add seats is through a charter amendment, because your charter is very specific on how it's supposed to be done.
Yeah. So you again, just to reiterate the point, is that the charter is basically our constitution and establishes the number of representation. The charter has in the document that says that the districts are supposed to be apportioned close to, or supposed to be apportioned in a way that is fair and equitable. And when the information was shared, you see there's significant deviations. And so every 10 years, the city is to undertake in this particular process. And so this will affect the next election because it is within that window that it's not 270 days from an actual election. So once the board codifies it by virtue of an ordinance, then it will go into play as it relates to what the new district boundaries are.
So just one last question. So when you make this happen, are there going to be more people running for the next election, or still the same?
There could be more people running, but it's only running for the same number of seats. Correct.
Okay, early on, the gentleman was asking you to my left, was asking you about the surge in the number of people that is inhabiting Singer Island now. First, with the downturn because of COVID, and then when people came and we had more people to become homesteaded, more people to occupy residency on Singer Island. If you were explaining, if I heard you correctly, that the only thing that you have to work with is what has happened since the census and up until March. Is that correct?
So the way we did our projection to add population was what happened since the census through March 2024. It's important to note the addresses that were there before the census, they got a census form. Right? So they got a census form. Whether somebody who owned that unit filled it out as their residency, we would never be able to determine, right? Because the data is not aggregated by unit basis, it's aggregated in a block. But they got a census form. Now let's say, just for hypothetical, they lived in New York and that's where they claimed their homestead, and then they relocated to Florida. There will not be a data set that we could attribute with population, like you mentioned homestead. Homestead doesn't say there's 9 people in my house, there's 2 people in my house. It just says that this is where I'm declaring my domicile for tax purposes, realistically. So there's not a data set that would supplement or give us information that would lead us down a different path. I hope that answers your question. So what we did, and I'll forward it to you real quick here. Staff gave us projects that were issued a certificate of occupancy from census day through March 2024. And that information we utilized based on your per person average for your home. Did I go back? Oh, there it is, right here, sorry. These were the projects that were given certificates of occupancy from census day moving forward to March 2024. And those were put into our analysis so that we can try to give you the most accurate information so that the council can make the best possible decision in terms of how the district should look.
Okay.
add to that?
You can't even get the
Typically,
question out.
when we go through this process, to answer your question, it's usually immediately after the release of the census data. So the fact that we're doing this 4 years or 3 years after the release of the census data is a bit abnormal. And so these questions you have wouldn't typically be experienced as part of the redistricting process. The next time you do the redistricting process, we would recommend that you do it a year, immediately upon the census data being released. So the type of questions you have, they can't really be answered until the next census, which will be 2030.
So you can't actually use accurate data because
accurate
be
data.
that as it may, we know that there was a surge in people that are now occupying in District 4. But because you're saying that we don't have the vehicle to count that number of people, you're only going to count what was actually done 2020 at the head of the census. So everything that happened between what you received from staff that happened between then and March 2024, you're not going, going forward with your job, that you're not getting all of the information and all of the numbers that are actually there. So this is what that's why I'm saying, how can we actually use that data, knowing that we had somewhat of a unusual occurrence with COVID. We're going to move forward with this project, but we know firsthand that we don't have all the data because in 2020 we took the census. You're going with that, and all kind of things happened from 2020 to March 2024.
Correct.
So you don't have everything in you. I mean, as you stated,
We have the best available data. Every census is a snapshot of the population. And of course, on April 1st of 2020, that snapshot is as accurate as it possibly can get. But with time, as time progresses, then that estimate or that enumeration of the population is going to become less and less and less accurate. So you're absolutely right. 4 years have passed since Census Day of 2020. And it would be great if we could do a census every year. But of course, that's very expensive. It's not going to happen. So the best that we can do is to try to update the 2020 census with the housing data that we have, solid data. We have solid data. Now, you're talking about anecdotal evidence that the surge has occurred, and we recognize that that's true, but there's no data set that says exactly how many people have moved into any given block in the city. So unfortunately, we have to use the best available data. And so that's the 2020 data and the population estimate based upon construction that's occurred since Census Day of 2020.
By the way, if I could add one other item. During the census, we saw a couple things that were different than previous censuses, and that is, if you probably look at your home construct, right? You probably see larger families living in a home. Maybe the kids don't leave for college. Maybe they have to stay home. One of the things that cities try to do collectively is to encourage people to make sure every person in their household was counted. Maybe grandma lives in the house. She counts in that house. She counts as part of that population. And the census tries really hard to do that. If the census form wasn't filled out, the census hired enumerators that went and knocked on doors. So if that house was then being occupied by somebody else, or maybe it was a seasonal person, that person at that moment in time said, you know what, I already filled out my census form in New York. So that person's been counted somewhere, in some way, shape, or form. Remember, we're counting people. We're not counting residents. We're not counting homeowners. We're not counting immigrants. We're counting people. This data set is the most complete data set that's available at the scale that cities need in order to go through this process, and we amplified it by going to your staff to say, hey, have you guys built anything? And what we've seen in South Florida as a whole over the last 4 or 5 years is trying to account for that surge in population. It's trying to account for those new people trying to relocate to Florida. The demand for multifamily housing is huge. It's why you're seeing this growth that you saw here, as well as single-family homes. So we tried really hard working with your staff to get the best available data so that we can educate the council as much as possible and they can make the best possible decision.
I do want to take an opportunity to recognize State Senator Bobby Powell that's also joined us.
Quick question. So it will require a charter change, but if you guys made everything west of Congress a district and made it 5, I want credit for that. Second, the AMRIT was under construction, and to Dr. Spiritus' point, a lot of people, everyone keep highlighting that a lot of people after the Great Exodus turned their district, turned it into a homestead, so now that is their home. But my bigger issue is, and it's probably simple, so you guys are going to make these changes. However, these changes have to be adopted at a council meeting by that council. So by the city council, by the city fulfilling this whole thing about redistricting, does it have to be adopted? Because if they don't adopt it, the changes are there, but they wouldn't go into effect, correct?
So we were hired as consultants to give you the best available options to look at your districts. As we've stated before, the city has not gone through a redistricting effort in over 40 years. I can't answer that. I wasn't here, okay? But I would tell you that they've engaged us to try to do this process, and we're here to present that information. Now, it is up to the council to adopt a map. I would have the council talk to their legal to determine what happens if they don't do that, okay? I would tell you that redistricting is not an easy thing for anybody. People don't like change, generally speaking. But at the same time, your staff has brought people that we don't have skin in the game. We're just here to work on a math problem. We're here to look at the data and give you the best solutions as part of that math problem. That's why we're here. We're not political. We're looking at the data, and we're going to try to give you the best options so that you can make the best decisions as a community.
We want to do these questions. So I was going to go there. So obviously, I haven't gone back and watched, the meetings, and it probably, in most cases, that this is a very controversial item, right? And so probably in certain cases, it was a situation where invariably the proverbial can was kicked. But in the event that the board does not consider adopting the map that addresses something that's in a charter, that is the charter is the agreement between the residents, the voters, and the board. And so if in fact they do not comply, you can take legal action to enforce the charter because that is your governing document. So if somebody was to violate the Constitution, you would go through a process to effectively compel the board in a legal proceeding to adopt it to make sure there's equity as it relates to the items here. So the board is going to invariably make a decision and make a decision based on the factual information that is provided to them, and that would be staff's recommendation.
Were they not supposed to do this within the 40 years, 10 years ago, or 10 years ago? Do you know what happened to those proposals, if there were any?
From the research that I've been able to glean, and I haven't seen any situation where it never came forward or there was so.
And just not to belabor the point, but just to piggyback off of the two individuals that spoke to the data, I understand there was a population growth maybe in District 4, but even on the mainland, during this time you talked about COVID, many people were very leery about even answering their doors during this time frame. Number two, we also experienced a lot of dilapidated, and closures and board ups and whatnot. But when the upturn of the economy took place. It took place during this same time. So you're going to experience some contractions, some expansions with existing homes that were boarded up, duplexes, quadplexes, that now, because of the return of the economy and the housing boom, this opened up a great deal of opportunities for individuals to now renovate, refurbish those places. So you're going to see that also too. And I do not think that that was probably covered in the census and that accurate data. Lastly, because of high inflation, you have a lot of individuals moving back home. So therefore, if you look at most homes that were just accommodating 1 or 2 homes, now you see 4 and 5 cars. And actually, as you traverse throughout the community, it's harder for you to get down some of the streets because it wasn't considered, or factored in. So that is, I guess, some of the issues that people may be dealing with is how accurate is the data, especially in this anomaly coming out of post-COVID.
So let me address that real quick. Now, your charter did something very smart. Okay, your charter says must not vary by more than 8%. So you have room within the map as we draw it, because we're not going to give you an option that's more than 8%. That some of that growth that right now we're looking at is anecdotal growth. I don't disagree with you. A dilapidated home then gets repaired and someone moves in. That's really what we call anecdotal data, right? But that can be accounted for in this 8%. So the districts, we're going to do our best to give you options that are as close as possible. But you have the variation that's allowed. Now, if you forward to what we're at today, we've got a spread between districts that is just astronomical. There is just such a big gap between the way the districts are aligned that not doing something or waiting until 2034 or 2031, because by the way, the census data, census day will be April 1, 2030, we still won't get that data until 2031. There is no data set that's better than the census.
So that's part of my question. And going back, the city is 100 years old now as of, I think it was 2022. And thank you, Mr. Evans, for providing the context as relates to the background with the 40 years of it not being, that's not being brought before the council. But my question is, why would, if the census is now we're 4 years out from the census, or 3 years, or depending on when that the census information came back, would it be more realistic for us to wait until the next census? And would we be able to, would there be a situation where we could include in that ordinance that it comes back every 10 years when we have the census every 10 years? Or I don't know when that provision, when the districts were established and when they were included in the charter at that time, but would we be going by the conception of when that was added to the charter for every 10 years? And do you know what those dates are?
So,
and would this make sense to still do it now?
The ordinance that governs your charter, I believe, was adopted in 1975. Okay? So let me parcelize your question. First things first. Not doing anything means that the people in District 4 and the elected official for District 4 represents about, let's just call it plus or minus 4,500 people. The person in District 1 represents about 17,000 people. So if you wait to try to get another data set, whether it's the census, whether this change is just going to grow larger, because we know that people are still coming back to the community. We know that the housing units are changing. So that change is just going to expand. So the only way to change your charter is by a recommendation by the council or by your charter. Again, we have to go through the charter because there's very specific ways to change a charter. I'm going to use my city as an example. My city back in 2014, our charter said that we had to look at the districts every 4 years, which means we were doing this population projection thing. And sometimes it didn't align with the census. So what we did is we put a ballot question on the ballot for the voters to say, do you want to redistrict every 10 years following each census? And I'm paraphrasing the language. We also put something in our charter to say that it needed to be a 4-year public institution to do that because we wanted to make it apolitical. The voters overwhelmingly said yes.
You're going to always have council people. Every other year.
That's why I was just saying, even though, to me, like, I don't have a position, either way, but it would make more sense for it to come back. Of course, now it's starting to come back every 2 years, but like.
So what's, after 2025, city manager, when's the next election after that?
2027.
2027. So when I tell you that this cycle will just keep going, there's yeah. Yep.
I
Yes,
have a
ma'am.
question. Can you go back to the previous slide? I want to make sure I read something
The
right.
charter?
Yeah.
Also, I do have about 20 more of the copies. If anyone would like a hard copy of the PowerPoint, I can go
Okay.
grab them. So just
So it
keep
should
your
be
hands up.
divided into 4 voting. Okay, that's what I thought. It says the city of Riviera Beach shall be divided into 4 voting districts. So it seems as if this whole concept is predicated on voting and how voters are impacted. With regard to using something as abstract as household counts and whatnot, why is this not predicated on registered voters?
So that's a really good question. So first things first, a long time ago in many cities charters talked specifically about registered voters. And districts were divided by registered voters. But redistricting is really a function of population. Does the commissioner only represent a voter? Or does the commissioner represent everybody in that household? From mom to dad to the children to grandma, whomever's in that house, they represent everybody. So realistically speaking, looking at the data that way, we want to try to capture that biggest grouping.
What happens to things like fire departments when the redistricting passes? Is that not impacted at all, really?
Not at all.
You know, the question that I had, and I'm glad it was stated, why not put it on a referendum instead of letting the council people decide what we need to do on the map? So how can we get that in 40 years? Like the people that ran for election, could they file a lawsuit being that this hasn't been changed in 40 years like someone else have already done?
So I won't get into the idea of lawsuits. You know, look, we're a litigious society. We sue for everything these days, right? So, okay, so that being said, the state created legislation that governed how cities are supposed to do this. They gave a parameter. You can't have this done within a certain period of time. They saw that these things were happening, and they passed some legislation to make sure that it works in a certain path. So we're going to do our best to follow that path and give the council the best advice they can to stay within that path. So I understand what you're saying. I'm going on 25 years of redistricting. Dr. Schultz has been doing it since the 70s or 80s. He's been doing it much longer than I have. Putting a map on a ballot, not a practical term, because you won't be able to evaluate options. Now, if your council or your charter review board or whomever's meeting to discuss those items, you want to discuss things like number of districts, how you do this, that's something that should come from your council, through your charter review board, or from your council itself, and those are the types of items that usually end up on a referendum. And by the way, charter questions on referendums are really challenging because there's different rules when you put them out there, whether you can educate, whether you can't do things. It's a very complex process. And that's why usually there's charter review commissions. And again, I would ask the room, have you ever looked at the charter? The charter is a complex document. I know Mr. Evans has. It's a very complex document. And well, that's what, you know what? So that's something that can't happen. They can't change the language to fit them because the charter to be amended has to go on a ballot as a via referendum. And that's the way your process is. Correct, Mr. Evans?
That's correct, yes.
No. I don't know a city. I am not aware of a city where you can change the charter without a referendum. The charter is your constitution for your city.
It's the roadmap.
One second.
Hi, good evening. I totally agree, and I am hoping that we do proceed forward because it is heavily unbalanced. We have known for years that the District 1, which McCoy serves, has always been overpopulated, and it will continue to be that. District 3 as well, Ms. Lanier District, we have always known that. And we had said out west, because that corridor is constantly being built up, that perhaps that out there could be also be established as a district, because a lot of that encompasses District 1 as well as District 3. And a lot of times it be unserved because it is steadily, constantly growing. And I was informed, and she's passing going on, that out west was supposed to become another district, because in the years that will proceed, it will be totally growth that will be there. And that is exactly what is happening now. I do not perceive that this being delayed, not until 2017. The time is now, so let us go ahead on and process this and do what we need to do in order to establish what we need.
So I have a question. First, thank you for the information. It's very informative. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much for that. So my question, to me, it seems like it'll come down to just numbers, right? Just based on what you're saying. And all this we're talking about back and forth, it comes down to numbers, right? But what are some of the other factors that you may consider as you're making these recommendations? So I just want to know, what are the other factors?
So at the end of the presentation, we talked about some of the things that impact our decisions, okay? The Voting Rights Act impacts our decisions. Fair districts impacts our decisions. We outlined some of the parameters that we utilize. I'll get there in just one second here. But we do use a variety of data sets when we're looking at these things. Minority population information. That comes into play when we're looking at these districts. You try not to artificially dilute or pack, or there's a whole bunch of terms when you hear redistricting. You know, we try not to do that. We try to keep those numbers there. I'm going to use my example because it's very easy in the city of Pembroke Pines. City of Pembroke Pines is approximately, you want to let you keep clicking while I'm going. The city of Pembroke Pines has approximately 47% Hispanic, people who identify Hispanic via the census. So you wouldn't want to artificially dilute that population or pack that population into one area. Now, in our data, that population is spread over the whole community, so it's very difficult to say, oh, we'll just put all the Hispanic folk in this district and all the folk over here. You can't really do that because of the way the data is separated. So when we look at the data, we start to put these little tables together. We put this as part of our analysis to determine all of these little factors. So these are the typical criteria we utilize when we're going through this process. Now, within some of these things, if you look right here, this one right here, respect for communities of interest, that's some of that anecdotal information that we get from the public, right? Hey, this association really is very similar to this association, and they're right next to each other. It'd be really kind of a disservice to split those two up. And that's where the public, and they're part of this process, really comes into play. Because you are intimate with your community. Your council members are intimate with your community. So we start to look at these items, and all we're really doing is working on a big jigsaw puzzle. It's a big puzzle with numbers. It is, you know, it may sound a little geeky that this is what we like to do, but it's kind of a fun process. You start to look and you start to play this stuff because you really can start to see the impact it can have on a community when they get the same kind of representation. Yes, ma'am?
Hi.
Absolutely. You're Riviera Beach, but within there, you may have like maybe similar housing types. So maybe these houses were built around the same period of time, and the family units are similar in those, okay? You look at your map. Blue Heron is a very common boundary in your city. I-95 is a major divider in a city. But typically on either side of 95, you get a lot of industrial, and so some of the housing may not line up there. So we look at all these things. You are one community, and there's nothing that separates you from doing that, but you're a community that's broken up into 4 districts for the purposes of representation. So the residents in that community, that district, know who their voice is. There's other forms of government that maybe everybody gets elected at large, and they don't represent a district. I can tell you there's a city that's near me that everybody is elected. They all live in the same neighborhood. They all live in the same neighborhood, but they represent a city of over 100,000 people, but they're all from the same neighborhood. It doesn't feel very representative of that community. So the fact that you have single-member districts provides that different level of population. The person has to live in their district to be representative of that district. Sorry.
Okay. Yes, I have a comment and then a question. I think you addressed it, and I may have misunderstood. First, the comment. I served on the Charter Review Committee a few years ago, and if you think this is robust, you should have been there. It gets very...
I've been the liaison for ours a couple times. It's never an easy process.
Yeah. So my question is, since we're looking to expand these districts, do we need a referendum? Did you address that?
The map can be adopted by the council by ordinance. So you don't need a referendum to do that. You would need a referendum to do some of the things that some of the residents have suggested in terms of changing the number of seats or changing the process. Any of this language, the language that was up there from the charter.
I want to know, District 4, Singer Island has a lot of hotels and vacation property kind of things. How do you do the population in those types of buildings and stuff?
This kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. During the census, if it was an address that was a legitimate home, they would get a census form, okay? Now, again, throughout Florida, we've seen different, condotels, we've seen different things where people make their permanent residence. On census day, they filled out a form, or by census day, they filled out a form, and that population was attributed to this unit of measure, which is a census block. Those hotels, unless somebody filled out a form within those hotels that was their residence, that's what the people that lived in there, it's not going to be counted. Oh, not if they're just here for tomorrow, no, but
somebody keeps staying at that Marriott in terms of, it's not like the Marriott becomes empty.
oh, no. That doesn't factor.
All year long, somebody are in those units, but their census is taken wherever they came from.
That's exactly correct.
So, but they are still utilizing all the services while they are in.
Yep. Well, and to that point, every municipality that I'm aware of also was asking community members that were invariably snowbirds, count your numbers here for the purposes of making sure that monies, because what it does is it provides for representation both at the state and the federal level, and then provides for additional monies to be able to come. So that's where you had a situation where a lot of communities were advocating for, if you are a snowbird, make sure you count it in your community in Florida.
In my community, we have 3 retirement communities, Century Village being one of them. If you don't think that we were knocking on their door saying, hey, make sure this is your residence, that this is where you fill out your census form, it's such a major impact in terms of the dollars that come to your community. And I don't know a city out there that wasn't advocating that you fill out your form here, because we need those dollars from hospitals to about every grant is tied to your population from the census, so that those shares all come this way. That's why when you use this data set, it's the best available data.
I'm sorry to bring COVID up again, but I was looking at the census thing, and it says in March 12th is when they opened up their phone lines, and then April 1st, everybody's supposed to dedicate where they were living at that moment. Let's have their 0 day. April 1st of 2020 was historic in terms of the closures across the country, and everybody was going home. All the snowbirds were going home to be at their home because everybody was scared to death. To ignore that elephant in the room of COVID and its impact on this community seems like a big guess.
So what you're reading is really when they started the enumeration process. Census forms were given out well before that. So that's when they started to see that, hey, you haven't returned your form, so they're starting their enumeration, their door knockers, their handouts. April 1st was the deadline. It wasn't the beginning of the process, it was the deadline. So you could have filled out your form well in advance. In fact, I will tell you this. We as a city, Broward County, Palm Beach County, they had action teams watching the census, watching how people were filling out their forms. They were seeing what the counts were looking like. 60% of the forms have been returned, 30% of the forms. That process happened over the period of 4 or 5 months, so that people were already filling out their forms prior to that April 1st date. Those were kind of like that was the drop dead. This is when we stopped taking in forms and we changed our enumeration process. Yeah, and then they go back and that's when they go back and they look at the data to make sure that, hey, this is good data, this isn't fraudulent, and all those types of items.
So after Census Day, the census sends out volunteers, workers to go and knock on people's doors. If they haven't filled out their form, hey, make sure you fill out your form, make sure you fill out your form. So it's April 1st is the formal deadline, but then there's a curing period afterwards.
And part of the other problem that happened with this census, because of COVID, is that data was released a lot later than it was in previous census times. So cities were waiting. Many cities were worried because some cities' charters are very specific. You have to do redistricting within a period of their charter. So cities were waiting for that data to come out, and it kicked off the redistricting cycle as we know it as consultants in a much later fashion than we did historically.
Good evening, everybody. Bobby Powell. Of course, I just want to let everybody know the redistricting process is not something that's new. Each municipality should be doing redistricting. It happens in West Palm Beach. It happens in Palm Beach County. It happens at the state level. If you all will recall, the reason I am your state senator is because I was serving as state representative from 2012 to 2016. And in 2016, because the legislature, had drawn those maps incorrectly, they were sued by a number of groups, including the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, and they had to redraw the Senate districts. In kind, I ended up running for the new Senate district. But the state did pass a law. I believe Clay Yarborough added something to the law this year, and he's a senator from Jacksonville. But in statute, it says here, and y'all got to forgive me because I don't have my reading glasses. When I hit 35 and a half, but it does say here under statute 166.0321, division of municipalities into districts. This is in state law. Each municipality shall from time to time fix the boundaries of its districts so as to keep them as nearly equal in proportion to their respective population as practicable, provided that such changes may not be made in the 270 days before a regular general election for the governing body of the municipality. Districts may not be drawn with the intent to favor, which the legislature has done, that's why they got sued, or disfavor a candidate or a member of the governing body or an incumbent member of the governing body based on the candidate's or incumbent's residential address. Any ordinance enacted or adopted by a municipality on or after July 1st, 2023, which is in conflict with this, is void. So for us, we do redistricting in every even year after the 10-year decennial census. So we did redistricting in 2012. That's why in 2012, when I ran for State House, I ran in District 88 as opposed to what was 84. Mac Bernard served you all in 84. Priscilla served 84. Addie Green served 84. Hank Harper served 84. I served in 88. This year, in 2022, 2 years ago in 2022, when they did redistricting, they changed what District 88 looks like. Instead of going down to Delray, it now goes over to Royal Palm. But but coincidentally, when they changed it, they did not change the number. So 88 remained 88, so now you're served by Representative Edmonds. For me, I was Senate District number 30. I went from Tequesta down to the bottom of West Palm Beach. My district changed. I am now District 24. My district now starts at PGA Boulevard South and goes down to Hypoluxo. I could have been drawn in the same district as Lori Berman, and me and her would have had to do what we had to do, right? But many times in these redistricting processes, as you see, the map is split into the number of population for this particular city. So unfortunately, it could happen where some of our elected officials may just end up being drawn into the same seat. That has happened in the legislature. It happens every 10 years. Some people move. I don't know if that is allowed for in the charter, but it makes sure that we're equitable in terms of the city. Remember, many years ago, there was nothing that really existed like near Walmart. You didn't have Thousand Oaks. You didn't have Sonoma Bay. You didn't have Woodbine out there and all those different things that have come up. So this is a process that really is, in my opinion, necessary, and unfortunately, it's regulated by the state. Whether you want to do it or not, that is a law. And, of course, it has been brought to the attention, but many years ago, in 2012, I once asked that question, does the city of Riviera Beach do redistricting? And the question in that time from the planning department, I was told by the planning department in 2012 that the population had not adjusted enough for there to be a required trigger to do a redistricting process. Now we're talking about 40 years. Now, I know we're looking at what could have happened from the last 4 years since the census was done in 2020, but really that shift and that deviation from those 40 years is the real impact that you have to look at. So my question is, the question I have, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Evans or you guys, when the redistricting is done, does that mean that all 5 seats are now up because they're all brand new seats?
So I would say that it would affect those that are running for election in 2025. Those that are incumbents and currently in their seat, they will retain their seat until the next election. However, there will be a situation whereby those that are their constituents in their respective district, once those maps are drawn, that goes into effect immediately. So there will be situations where persons that are in a district now that are used to a constituent base, let's say of 5,000, could go up to 8,500 or 9,000.
The goal when we draw these maps is that everybody is going to be close to that 10,000 mark as possible. That's the goal, is we're trying to get as close as we can. The charter provides us a little bit of deviation room, but that's the goal, is that each district represents about 10,000 people. The charter provides guidance in terms of how those elections work. In most situations that we've encountered, if you were just elected to your seat, you continue to serve out your term. It's the next term that would be impacted by it.
One of the things I think it's important to also note is that the way in which the districts are contemplated and how it is provided for in the charter is to ensure that your elected officials live throughout your respective community, as stated earlier. However, they all run at large. So it is appropriate to contact any of the elected official on whatever issue it may be because they represent the community at large. Their residency, their domicile, that is for the purposes to ensure that not everybody lives in a condo and has the same perspective or same daily routines or what have you. So it is just ensuring that there is fair and equitable representation throughout the city so persons can experience whatever that issue may be in that respective district. But an issue in the city in District 1, 2, 3, or 4 is an issue for the entire balance of the board.
I think we've also, in this last cycle, I think this is the 10th city we've done in this particular cycle since 2020 election. And we've had large cities and small cities, and some cities redistrict every 10 years, some cities redistrict more than every 10 years. And then we've had a few cities that haven't redistricted in a long, long time. And the thing that those cities seem to have in common is that all their commissioners or councilpeople were all elected at large. And so the impetus for those cities seemed to be, oh, well, we don't really need to do it because we're all elected at large. So what does it matter if the districts are the same size or not? And so there's not total validity to that, but there's some validity to that. So I think that might be what's going on here. But the population equity, again, as we mentioned, is about having access to run for the council seat, rather than being elected by the same number of people, represented by the same number of people in each district.
A lot of the triggers for this conversation, or at least the conversations that have been happening side by side, is single-member district versus all-member district, and the start of getting to one or the other, staying as we are or going into single-member district, is going to be relegated by this. Is that a conversation that happens side by side, or is one predicated on the other? And I don't know if that's a question for you or you, Mr. Evans. Like, how does that come into play? Whether or not there's a shift in what we are as district.
Well, any change to what's in the charter, as I mentioned before, is a product of Charter Review Board, the council adopting something and getting on a ballot.
Right.
So remember, it's important, the ballot goes back to the people. Right. But it has to get there first, and the only way that happens is through a process.
So to that point, invariably, you would have a situation where the existing complement will remain the same. And in the event that there was a desire to move to bona fide single-member district, that would be a situation whereby it needs to come up through whether it's the council or the Charter Review Committee for the purposes of being placed on the ballot for voter consideration. But the construct of the charter right now does not provide for that.
And by the way, we've seen it go back and forth. We've seen people do charter amendments. Like we did a districting project in one city. The next time we did it, there was a charter amendment, and they did it another way. So it really becomes the will of the people if those items get on the ballot.
So I understand and I get the law and I get the charter and how all of that's set up. My thing is, if we're going by numbers, right, why can't the city just initiate its own census to get more accurate numbers as to what, the numbers that are here now?
I would tell you that that is a extremely expensive endeavor.
Oh.
Now, don't get me wrong. If you're the city of Lazy Lake in Broward County, which has 32 people, we could probably knock that out in a day.
It was just a question. Since
Yeah,
we're going by numbers,
I make
then
light of it because you're not. I will say this. So in my 20-something years doing this, that question is the only question that gets happened every time we do a census redistricting project.
Okay.
It's just not a realistic thing.
Okay.
And you can talk about in the days of when the Florida was exploding.
Is the city going to do a citywide information, campaign to let people know specifically what's going on? I mean, like mailers or anything like that. And then also, instead of, it seems like you're pushing this down everybody's, throat for 2025. I think this should be something that should be addressed in 2027, the next election in 2027.
So a couple of things to kind of unpackage that, right? It is a situation where now we know there's inequity in the system. And so invariably the do-nothing option provides for legal exposure for the city, because the same way in which you would say not go for till 2027, somebody right behind you can say, no, I'm going to sue to enforce you complying with what's provided for in the charter. And so now that we know that there is an inequity in the system, we have to move through the process, and the policymakers invariably have to make a decision. The other side of it is the question that you asked with regards to the city doing it. I love my staff, I trust my staff, but the reality is I'd never want to place that burden on somebody who is the bona fide census taker, and they miss a number or miss something, or somebody will tear through that data and find one inequity in it and find a situation to invariably. So having a situation that is provided for in the actual Constitution, and it is provided, the census has to be presented to the president. It is actually in the U.S. Constitution as it relates to the information for persons getting counted. So we'll let the feds do it, but it would just be too much risk and too much exposure for the agency if we were to ever consider doing that. Right. Well, that's what these guys are here for, right? To help us through the process. But I would defer to them. I don't know.
Yeah. Speaking about cities taking on their own censuses, I've only one time got involved in that. It was an expensive event, okay, and it was only for a subsection of the city because it was new to the city. It was an annexation, and it's very expensive to do a census. That's why the federal government has the responsibility.
If you put in perspective, a city of 40,000's probably got somewhere between 10,000 to 12,000 housing units. The time it would take, the cost it would take, and then again, you still get time and place. So did I count that person? Were they a resident here? Were they not a resident here? Are they a snowbird? That's why the census does what they do in the path that they do it. And that's also why we asked staff, because we knew there was a gap, for the projection based on, hey, what's new? where have these things happened? And that's how we came up with the projection, add that extra plus or minus 2,000 people to the numbers to try to give them the best and the most accurate information.
Can you go to the map, please?
Is there one at the end? Yeah.
Okay. So earlier I had said something about the district, redoing the district and have everything west of 95 be a district. And the reason I do say that is I've lived in this city for 21 years, okay? I'm in District 3. In all that time, I do not recall that anyone who was in the District 3 seat lived west of 95. So and I don't think anyone who's ran for District 1 has lived west of 95. So we have, I'm going to call it the Military Trail Corridor. We have issues that all of us who live along Military Trail that are similar. And I know you were talking about, the similarities. We have a lot of HOAs. We have some apartments. We have some combinations of apartments and housing. So that Military Trail Corridor, I don't think at least in my time, we've ever been fully represented by somebody who actually lived there to know what we as residents need in that area. So that's why I'm saying I don't know how you're doing. We probably do have 10,000 residents from that, I think. I don't know. But it's just something I would hope you guys would think about, and I wanted to inform you of, because yes, that Military Trail Corridor, we have issues. And we all have the same issues. If you go to our next door pages, we're all talking about the same issues. So, thanks.
All right, any other final questions before we get ready to close out this evening?
Well, this might not speak to our redistricting, but it does speak to the fact that persons living east of I-95, representing the corridor that was drawn on the west side, is because a lot of people were congested and put into one single area when we had all our racial problems going on. So you found that a majority of people were put into certain areas. When people started and had the opportunity to buy homes, a lot of people migrated from the West Palm Beach area and was purchasing in those particular areas. As for on the south end of town, when a lot of people and veterans came to move and was given an opportunity to purchase homes. So with redistricting, with redlining and things of that nature, that's why you found such large populations of people stuck in one congested area when out west there weren't many homes out there at that time, and when homes started to be built out there, it was looped into that. So that is just why it happened as it did. Maybe or maybe not, we do need another seat, but it wasn't, it was designed that way initially, but it turns around now to bite people, as you would say, in the rear.
All right. Again, I want to thank our presenters this evening for their time, energy, and effort in the particular process. We do have a sign-in sheet that's provided for in the back of the room. We will utilize that sheet for the purposes of informing you if there is subsequent community meetings, but more importantly, once it gets before the policymaking board for the purposes of discussion. Also, I will send you both the redistricting website. We have a redistricting website that's on our page, and there is a report that accompanies, that is the backup for all the information that's provided, and it gets into greater specificity on the items that were contained and make some of those numbers come to life. And so I will make it a point, our staff will send that out to you, both the PowerPoint if you didn't get it this evening, as well as the link to the page, and on that page you'll actually see the report. If you do have any questions as it relates to or any suggestions concerning redistricting, I will provide an email address for you to send those questions, comments, concerns, or perspective after you read the report or you have an opportunity to think back on the conversation that occurred today, and then we'll make sure it gets to our consultants expeditiously for the purposes of making sure your opinions and perspectives are heard, consistent with what is provided for the purposes of facilitating redistricting. I cannot thank you all enough for being here. I really do appreciate it, and it shows that this is very important for the community to participate in this, and I think the team here is elated about the public participation. In most cases, when you have situations like this, you have 2 or 3 people in the room, and so we can anticipate that there will be more conversation, more dialogue, but please understand that it does not stop here. It does not stop at first reading of the ordinance. It doesn't stop till second and final reading of the ordinance. Once those maps are identified, obviously there will be a public information campaign to inform folks as to what the changes are, what occurred, because it will invariably impact the subsequent election that will happen in 2025. And so, again, I want to thank you all for being here. If we can give our presenters a round of applause. So, certainly, as a graduate from the University of Central Florida, I was kind of leery partnering with FAU, but I think they're a great team, and we're glad to have them on board, and they've done really great work. And I can tell you they come well recommended from a lot of the municipal managers here in Palm Beach County that have gone through this process. So their work is tried and true, and they're going to do the right thing despite what people may think or concerns may be. They're going to make sure we have some options, but some options that make sense and that are defensible. So thank you all for being here this evening. Please make sure you sign in.